My name is Sarah Hirsch. I'm a manager of programs at Orange Coast College School of Sailing and Seamanship. And I also am a licensed captain, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of that and what that means in a couple minutes. But just to give you my license background, I started at the 100-ton level. I was a sailing instructor for Outward Bound, and they take kids out on open sailboats, so no cabins or anything, for 12 to 30 days. And the lead instructor on the boat also has to be a captain. And so I was an instructor with Outward Bound. I'd been sailing since I was young, and I had also been teaching, and I was put in the captain training program. And so I took a 100-ton class, and we'll talk a lot more about what that looks like in a little bit. But ended up, because I've done some sailing on larger vessels, having tonnage to actually go test at the Regional Exam Center for a 200-ton license. And in the course of my experience, I worked on sail training vessels up to 500 tons. So I've tested at the Regional Exam Center up to 1,600 tons, because that's the way Coast Guard licenses work. You can get a license for a boat that's bigger than you have sailed on or own to a certain degree. So I've taken a lot of the tests. I can feel like I can truly speak to what's hard, what you can get around, and what you really need to do to prepare to go in and take your tests. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what the licensing process looks like, what it means, and hopefully I can answer a lot of questions too. So I really do hope to see that. And if you would rather not raise your hand or speak up, just go ahead and put something in the chat box, and I'll make sure to check it once in a while. And Chrissy, since you've already been my great helper over there, telling everyone to stay on mute when they are not talking, if you see that the questions are piling up, can I tag you to interrupt me? I see that
I have to find where to keep them where they show up. I guess, yeah, just click on the chat box. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So now, so that everyone can practice with the chat box, I'm just going to ask that you go over to the chat box and just type in where you're from, because I'm curious what, if everyone's local or if we've got folks from other parts of the country. So if you don't mind, just type in where you're from. Newport Beach, Anaheim, Free, Seattle. Wow, great. Fullerton, Hermosa Beach, Newport Beach, Montana, Costa Mesa. That's exciting. All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. And for those of you, Olympia, excellent, that may be calling in from a slightly different time zone. Thanks for staying up with us. So we're gonna just get started right here. Let's see. So as I told you in my brief introduction, I have a background in teaching and sailing. So please forgive me on any of my Zoom skills, but hopefully I can make this work. All right. So we've checked our audio and visual connections as far as I can tell, but jump in if you're having trouble, and chat room function. I've told you a little bit about myself, and I'm sure I'll throw in a few more things as we keep going. I did do a pretty good job of taking attendance, but we are going to take a break in the middle of the session, and at that point I may just check to see who I'm missing. So we're just going to keep on chugging along. This was my screen if I had to do any troubleshooting with people, but I think we're set. Great. So we're going to start by talking about what is a merchant mariner credential or captain's license. For those of you who already know it, a lot of what we're starting from at the beginning, thanks for hanging in there. What I am going to do for a second is stop screen sharing, because I want to show you guys a few things. Can everyone see my video, or let me know if you can't? And again, the chat message is perfect for that. So I'm going to show you, first of all, this is what a captain's license used to look like. So you've probably seen these hanging on the wall. You might have one, or have, a coworker who has one, right? They're a certificate, they're a license. And so when you hear the phrase captain's license, people really are referring to that piece of paper. The way that used to be awarded is you would go in and take your tests at a regional exam center. You would pass them, you turn in all your documentation, you would sit in the waiting room, and the head examiner would print that certificate out and hand it to you. That was the only, I got that in 2004, and I think the year after they stopped doing licenses that you can hang on the wall. And instead, they're using these red books, which you may also have seen. And so what this allows a mariner to do is to have multiple endorsements. So we're going to talk about officer endorsements today, specifically the captain's license. So when I say captain's license, I'm really using a common phrase that the Coast Guard's outdated and now it calls them endorsements. But they're the same idea, just different pieces of paper they're printed on. The reason why these books exist is that depending what your experience is, you may have a rather long list of endorsements. So I've also worked as an AB, so a qualified deck crew member on larger vessels. So I have my AB in there, I have my firefighting, I have my international endorsements. That way they can just add them to this book like a passport. The other thing that ends up in that book that is rather new, because the US is working to keep up with international requirements, is something called a medical card. So it's just this kind of plasticky piece of paper that ends up going in the back of your red book. The medical card is renewed the same time your license is renewed, unless there's a special circumstance. And so that's why it's a separate card. So if you're working internationally, you actually have to renew it every 2 years instead of every 5 with a domestic license. If you have a medical condition where the Coast Guard wants to see a new medical form, they may approve you to go to sea, but maybe only for 1 year or 2 years. Then you need a new medical card, but you don't have to get a whole new red book. So I just wanted to show you the actual things we're talking about in hand. And then finally, for anyone who's really heard the lingo for a long time, this is a Z card. It's another thing people used to describe a credential with a way back, but you don't get a Z card anymore either. So it's the red book and the medical card. Okay, great. So I'm gonna go back to sharing my PowerPoint now. And so that is talking about what is a merchant mariner credential. They'll also call it an MMC for short. So the MMC is earned by submitting documentation regarding how much sea service you have or sea time. And we will, in the second half of this session, we're going to go into a lot more of that. We're also going to talk about what each of the different licenses are. We're going to talk about how you train or study, exam topics, and procedures for taking the exams, because they're a little bit of a mystery in themselves. What type of prep classes exist, what type of prep class might be good for you, or whether you would be self-studying for your credential. We're going to take a 10-minute break about an hour in, and then the second half of the hour, we're going to go over the paperwork that's required for applying for your license, because that in itself is daunting. And then finally at the end, some more time for questions. All right, so here's just some images of what I showed you before, the actual license that's now been retired, the red book, which is what you'll get now, and then the medical card, which I held up. All right, so we're going to start right away about talking about the different types of licenses. If there's probably a few folks in the room who may actually hold one of these, and feel free to speak up if you have anything to add, or if I've said something that might be confusing to the group. I'm really glad to have, you know, audience participation here. So a 6-pack is what you may have heard the operator of uninspected passenger vessels referred to. And the reason it's called a 6-pack is that it qualifies you to take up to 6 passengers on the water who are paying. And so this is a good reminder to let everyone know you cannot accept pay for taking people out on the water if you don't have some type of license. There's really no way around it. And especially out here in Southern California and in San Diego and here in Orange County and Long Beach, they do have, the Coast Guard is, you know, finding time to crack down on illegal operators. So at minimum, folks who want to operate a vessel for hire are going to want to have at least a 6-pack that would let you take 6 paying passengers out. Now, folks often find that having a license could be useful even if you're not looking to run a business or work for someone who's running a business. You may find that it helps you out with the insurance on your vessel if you submit your license to your insurer. You may find that all of the skills that you're learning in a captain's prep class would just be useful for you as a mariner. And certainly there's some pride in having a captain's license. So even if you're not looking to go get paid in a commercial operation, there's a lot of reasons people will end up getting their license. You know, but here in our area, offering charter trips and fishing trips, dive trips, excursions, those are all things you can do and often make money with 6 passengers on your boat. So that's why the Coast Guard's created this. And then the other thing is this keyword of uninspected vessels. So if you own a boat that can meet the Coast Guard's requirements for an uninspected vessel, which essentially means you're self-inspecting it, you're making sure it has life jackets, flares, radio, and that could be a whole nother hour-long webinar, is what an uninspected vessel needs, because the Coast Guard could walk on and they will inspect. So even though it's an uninspected vessel, they'll come look at it. In a minute, we'll talk about an inspected vessel. But point being, you're running a safe, well put together, supplied small boat with 6 people. To get this license or this endorsement, you need to be 18 years old, and you need 360 days of documented boating experience. So documented boating experience can be any time on the water, 4 hours or more, where you can have someone vouch for that, and they need to be the owner. If you're the owner, then you can vouch for yourself, but you do need to prove through a title or registration or insurance document that the boat was owned by you. At the second half of this webinar, we will look at the forms that you can fill out to document your sea service, and we'll get into the specifics there. That can range pretty far back in your maritime experience all the way to your youth, so 16 years of age. And so, you know, for a lot of folks, there really is a lot of sea time that you might have in your background, but keep in mind, oh, we have some great questions here, 1 second. So keep in mind that you do need 90 of your days to be within 3 years. They call that recency. So say you grew up living on a boat all through high school, but you haven't been on a boat since then and you're 42. Well, you're gonna need that 90 days of recency before you can apply. So that just makes sure they know that folks are relevant. So how far outside of the line of demarcation may you carry paying passengers? That's a great question. So my understanding is for the 6-pack, it's 100 miles, even though for the, and we'll get to the tonnage licenses, and that's 200 miles. That's a full near coastal license. So you can go offshore with this, but not as far offshore as if you had a large license. Thanks, Deb. And then how does each 24-hour period count as sea time? Great question. We can count a day on the water as a day. So, so in 24 hours, if you're on the water for all of 24 hours, it's still a day. And so we're counting in days. If you're on the water for 4 hours, it's a day. If it's less than 4, it's not a day. So 4 or more hours is a day. There's only a few situations where you could look for a day and a half of time, and that's if you work on a vessel that the Coast Guard's approved for time and a half. Usually that's a tugboat operated in a 2-watch system. If you go sailing with your friends in a 2-watch system, it doesn't count as time and a half. So the Coast Guard has to approve that you're in basically a short watch system where you're doing 12 on, 12 off. So anyway, to answer that question about how to count a sea day, it's going to be at least 4 hours, but you can't count, you know, extra hours to make extra days in one day. And then let's see, can the 360 days be only inland, or do there needs to be near coastal time as well? Great question. So we're gonna go into a little bit more of that in just a moment, and hopefully I can answer some of that. So we're gonna pass, you're also going to need to pass for all of the licenses we go through, a physical and a drug test. And we will look at the paperwork for that in the second half of the webinar. You're going to need to get a TWIC card. So the TWIC card is, for any of you who have done global entry, that might sound more familiar. Very same company and just about the same process where they're IDing you. They don't interview you, so I guess that might be the difference, but they're IDing you. You have to bring in ID, and then they're going to fingerprint you, and then they're going to send the background check that they get from that information to the Coast Guard. So essentially what the Coast Guard is doing is they're contracting their security or background check to the company that does global entry and TWIC card. So a lot of mariners don't need this card otherwise. It's transportation workers identity card. It's used in a lot of large port facilities to get in and out. But if you're sailing out of a marina, you're sailing out of a public dock, you'll never need your TWIC card after you get it. So I just like to remind people you're paying for a background check. If you go to renew your license later and you don't need your TWIC card, you don't need to renew it. So that saves you some money. There was a lot of grumbling in the maritime industry when this was first initiated. And then you're also going to need to take first aid and CPR. And this stands for all of the licenses. It does need to be within a year of when you apply. So something to think about that is that will expire. And the Coast Guard has a short list of places they'll accept that training from. So it could be a Coast Guard approved class, which you'd find at a school that offers Coast Guard classes, or it can be American Red Cross. That's the only school that they've approved for both first aid and CPR. They've approved American Heart Association for CPR only, but then you get stuck where you need to take first aid somewhere else. So I always tell people, look for an American Red Cross class. If you've had a different class, you're going to run into them turning your application around. And if your certification's over a year old, you're going to run into them turning it around. So just something to think about. If you think you're getting your license in the next year and you also need first aid CPR for work or something else that you do, is just go ahead and sign up for the right type of class. We do offer that class at the School of Sailing and Seamanship, and at the end of the program tonight, I'll show you how you can find that on our website. And then, of course, you know, the small last bullet point here, but not a simple task, is passing the exams. And so depending on where you would take, look to get information about getting your 6-pack, you may choose to go to the regional exam center and they're going to issue you tests. Or you may go take a 6-pack prep class somewhere. Or you could actually take a 100-ton prep class but apply for your 6-pack. So there's a lot of options for how you pass your exams. We'll get into that a little deeper. All right, let's see. So talking a little bit about the waters, and back to answer Deb's question, which was fantastic, is where you need to get that sea time we talked about. So again, it was 360 days, 90 days in the past 3 years. But then besides having something that says OUVP on your red book, on your MMC, it's going to say what waters you're allowed to operate in. And so you can operate inland if you have 360 days on any waters, navigable waters. So not the creek in your backyard, but any navigable waters. Great Lakes and inland. So the Coast Guard does count the Great Lakes as a different body of water, and generally as a body of water that's more complicated than inland, okay? So if you've never worked on the Great Lakes or sailed on the Great Lakes, you can't get the Great Lakes credential because you do need to have a certain number of days. You need 90 days on Great Lakes. And then near coastal, 360 days. And again, that was out to 100 miles offshore for the OUPV. And Deb, jump in there if you have anything as to why that's a little different than the tonnages. But it's just important to know so you don't take your 6 passengers too far offshore. 90 days of that needs to be either on the ocean, near coastal, or Great Lakes waters. So just something to think about when you're thinking about your background and where you've been on a boat. If you've been in Newport Bay a whole bunch, you've been in Lake Michigan a whole bunch, but you've never been outside of the sea buoy, then you won't be able to apply for that near coastal license at this time. Does anyone have any questions before we go past the OUPV? Okay, thanks everyone. All right, here we go. So now we're going to go into the tonnages. And so this is where you would, there are, you know, a few more components to the exam, although really not much. And so I'll spend a lot of time trying to convince you, if you have 360 days, go for a master's license. And so we have a 25, a 50, and 100 are our common tonnages that the Coast Guard will give out. And so those are the limited tonnages. And so we're going to talk about, first of all, the limited tonnages for an inland master. And so we've already talked just a tiny bit about the difference between inland, near coastal, and oceans. But just to give you a little bit more, inland would be Great Lakes or anything shoreward of the boundary line. And the Coast Guard defines the boundary line as a line that's generally drawn between the most seaward points of land, the entrance to a river, harbor, or bay. So for instance, in Newport Bay, as you get up to the jetty, then you're going to be seaward. You're going to be near coastal as you leave the jetty. And so just something to think about, again, your operating area. And certainly if you want to email me after this and ask about your operating area, we could look into it. But if you're working in an area where you may be sometimes inland and sometimes near coastal or ocean, that's something you'll want to check out, because that near coastal sea time that's really valuable if you're looking to have a license where you can get outside of the bay, depending where you're at. So, and finally, I didn't mention oceans too much, but know that if you want a license that says oceans on the end of it, that's going to be beyond the scope of what we're talking in this webinar about in this webinar. So an oceans license, you're going to need celestial navigation courses, and you'll need increased navigation stability and some other topics. And essentially the Coast Guard is testing you to be self-sufficient at a greater distance. So we are not going to be covering oceans at this time. So the master inland will qualify you to operate an inspected or commercial vessel. So an inspected vessel is a vessel with a certificate of inspection from the Coast Guard that allows the vessel to operate with a certain number of paying passengers. So thinking about the area where you live in, you can probably think of boats that you can go pay to go out on. A larger whale watching boat that might take 100 people. Hornblower is a company we have here locally that takes out a large number of people on their vessels. So the Coast Guard comes each year and inspects that vessel, and that's where we get that term inspected vessel. That vessel's COI, or certificate of inspection, will list the number of licenses that are required to be on the vessel. So often a boat that's just out for the day needs one captain and no other licenses. But if you have a boat that goes out overnight, it might need 2 captains that alternate watches, or 1 captain and 1 mate. And so that then of course drives employment, is if a vessel needs 2 captains, well, that's a pretty fantastic opportunity for someone to go on as the 2nd captain and get some training. Well, in a couple minutes, we'll talk about the mate's license. So that's also another great opportunity to get on board a vessel, work with your license in hand. So this 25, 50, or 100-ton master inland will qualify you to work on commercial vessels. And the tonnage increments are based on your documented time. In the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. We talked about the operating area. Even though we talked about the 6-pack or the OUPV, that's not required before you get a master's. And so depending what you want to do on the water, you can go right to the master's, and you don't need to get the OUPV. You can still be the captain of an uninspected vessel with a master's license. So if you think you might do some charter fishing, but you also want to work for Hornblower on their dinner cruises, well, get the master's license, because that would cover both. Okay. All right, so you need to be 19 years old for this ticket. Still a minimum of 360 days with the 90 days of recency. And then as we talked through the physical drug test, TWIC card, first aid, CPR, and exams, same thing for the inland master. All right, let's see. All right, so we're going to talk about the required sea service here. So starting with a 100-ton license, which is going to be the top of our limited tonnage before the tests get to a whole nother scope, again, beyond this. So you could get 150, you could get 200 if you've been working on a larger vessel and have that sea time. But it will mean you either need to find a specialized prep class for something over 100 tons or go test at the regional exam center. But anything 100 or lower is going to be covered by the same set of exams. And so for the 100-ton, you need 90 days on vessels of 51 tons or 180 on vessels 34 tons and over. This is gross registered tons, so it's calculated by the Coast Guard. Any inspected vessel is going to have GRT. So if you're working for an employer, you can find out the GRT of that vessel. If you're working on a private vessel or yacht, there are ways you can calculate it out. It may be listed in the vessel's documentation, but you'll want to find out that tonnage of the vessel, and that's not the same tonnage as if you put the boat on a scale. So just something to keep in mind. I would say this is not my area of expertise, but the GRT is essentially the way the Coast Guard can account for areas that passengers or machinery are in, but not necessarily voids and other spaces. So it allows them to bring that number down much smaller, which then means that a 100-ton vessel can get around a lot of regulations that a 200-ton vessel couldn't. So now shipbuilders are going to create a vessel with all these little loopholes and extra voids. They can have a large boat that's under 100 tons. So point being is you may see a rather large vessel that's only 100 tons. It's not the weight on the scale. So good reason to look up the tonnage of your vessels that you've had experience for. You might find that they have a greater tonnage than you thought, but it's likely it's going to be under 100 unless they're a cruise ship or a very large passenger vessel and somehow they can make enough money it's worth being that large. If you have time on vessel of 26 tons or 18 tons, depending on the time, then that would be a 50-ton license. And then anything under 25, you'll get 25-ton license. So as you can see, you're able to actually get a tonnage that's higher than your actual experience. And if you have experience on a 100-ton vessel, well, then you'd be able to actually qualify for 150 or 200 tons. So it's kind of interesting how that works, but good to know as you're looking at your sea time. All right, let's see.
You have a question there, Sarah, if you
want. Thank you, Chrissy. All right. Would you recommend someone get a master's inland with an OUPV endorsement? I guess there's no reason not to, but Deb, actually, I would love if you have a second to type in here if you have seen where this would be helpful to someone, and I would love to learn along with everyone else would be asking for a master inland. And so it's the reason why this comes up, if you think about it, it's the same amount of sea time for both, right? I've always suggested to people just go for their masters, but Deb, if you want to pop anything in as to why you do both, I would appreciate that. All right, in the meantime, and I'll come back and see what we've got in there.
So real quick,
go ahead, yeah.
Without typing. The only reason why I suggest it is because a master inland locks you into inland waters only, operating only on inland waters. If you get an OUPV endorsement, that opens you up to being past the line of demarcation.
Right, wonderful. Okay, great. So if you wanted to go work or take folks out 100 miles offshore to go fishing, you could do that with 6 people. And then you could go home, and the next day you could go work on a 100-ton vessel inland.
Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you, Deb. Wonderful. I really appreciate it. All right. So we will now we'll talk about the near coastal license. We're going to start with the mate. So a mate's license, you won't be in command of the vessel, but like I said, some inspected vessels require a master and a mate. The other great thing about this near coastal mate's license, and we'll get to it in a moment, the next slide, it also only takes 360 days. So every ticket we've talked about so far, or endorsement, is a 360-day requirement, and you can ask for more than one. So like Deb said, ask for your 6-pack, ask for your inland master. You could also ask for your near coastal mate if you have near coastal time. So this is going to allow you to operate up to 200 miles offshore. The same thing is going to be the minimum of 360 days, and the tonnage requirements are going to look the same as we just reviewed for your 25, 50, and 100. Let's see, I think I missed, sorry about that, guys. I'm having a little technical error here. Okay, it's at the bottom, just hidden on my screen. I'm not sure if the PowerPoint's too low for everyone, so I'll say this one slowly and clearly. But you need to have 180 days on ocean, near coastal, or Great Lakes routes to get the MATES license. So half your time needs to be near coastal, and if it is, then you can apply for this near coastal MATE. So for someone who only has 360 days total, but half or more of that is near coastal, then adding on this MATES license will get you that ability to work offshore. The other thing is that if you do take a Coast Guard prep class, and this is really where this is kind of, I would say, where you can get clever, is the certificate from the class will allow you to, it's like, I think of it as a one-time voucher. You hand it into the Coast Guard and you ask for what you want. So if you ask for a 6-pack Inland Master and MATE near coastal, they'll give you that in exchange for your course certificate. If you don't ask for the MATE near coastal, you go back a year later, they're going to ask you to take some exams. So you turn in your voucher, you get what you ask for. If you ask for more later, you need to take more exams later. And so that's another reason why doing this MATE near coastal, even if you're not sure you'd work as a mate, or maybe you're not working on boats at all, is worth asking for, because then it gets printed on your your credential. Yeah,
Hey,
and so go ahead.
sorry, can I jump in real quick?
Mm-hmm.
Also, another reason to get your OUPV endorsement added to your MATE, or sorry, added to your Inland Master, is that the same reason that you just said you don't have to retest, because if you just get your OUPV and you're fine with that, but later on you want to upgrade, you have to take more tests. But if you apply for a Master Inland with an OUPV endorsement, then you don't have to retake tests afterwards. If you want to upgrade to near coastal, then all you have to do is put in your paperwork without the tests. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I see. Is there an inland MATES license? There actually is an inland MATES license, and I believe it only requires 180 days of service. And so it's actually for folks who were looking for a foot in the door for work. You could apply for that with 180 days. Miranda, the one reason I wouldn't recommend, well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't recommend the inland MATES license. The thing is, with that 180 days, the only thing you can ask for is an inland MATES license, which means when you go to ask for the next thing, if you had taken a course, you would have to retest. So as Deb was saying, you want to ask for as much as you can at the same time. If you were to go for an inland MATES license, because it's only 180 days, you can't ask for anything else, and you'd have to retest. Now, if you like testing, and having worked my way up from the lower tonnage to higher tonnage, I've tested so much, and you kind of start getting this sadistic, like, hey, I'm going to do this. If you enjoy it, then go ahead and get your inland MATES license and work your way up to the higher level. But if you don't like testing, I would say get your 360 days. Okay. So we're going to go on to the Master Near Coastal. And so we've been talking about that 360 days, which is what all of the other endorsements required. But now that we get to the Near Coastal, this is going to require 720 days. And then, again, half that time needs to be ocean, near coastal, or Great Lakes. So that's 360 days outside of inland. And so that's doubling the amount of sea time. And, you know, as we think about it, the Coast Guard's authorizing you to take not just yourself, but paying passengers up to 200 miles offshore. So they want you to have twice as much experience. And I think that probably makes sense. Does anyone have any questions about the Near Coastal Master's License? Okay. I'm curious if there's anyone here who might be thinking who has the 720, who might be thinking of applying for that. You don't have to jump in, but if you'd like to, I'd love to hear if there's anyone. All right, and then the tonnage calculations, really you're just doubling what we talked about before. So for if you're doing the 100-ton, you need 180 days over 51 tons, 360 over 34. What might be even more helpful than me just showing you these slides is explaining to you where I got some of this information. And so this all can be found online. It can be tricky to dig up. So I also created a document that was shared with you yesterday as an email attachment that has some Coast Guard checklists. And I realized the links didn't work, so I'm actually going to resend you that document tomorrow. But in the document, it has a link to the Coast Guard's checklist for each of these licenses. And in that checklist, it spells out the same numbers I have on the screen right now. About a year and a half ago, I went to the National Maritime Center in Martinsburg, West Virginia. It's a large building where all your paperwork is mailed to, and there are folks who work there who've never been on a boat in their life, whose job it is to assess your qualifications. They're lovely folks. Most of them haven't been on boats. They take this checklist and they go through it and they check off the experience that you have and the paperwork you've turned in. So if you have the checklist in hand, then you know as much as the person evaluating you might know. And so I always tell people to go pull up the checklist for the license you're looking for. The hardest thing is how to find it. So again, in that PDF document I'll send out again tomorrow with the links, you can go get the checklist and you can get these numbers that I'm showing you. All right, a few other endorsements for those of you who are sailors. An auxiliary sail endorsement is an optional endorsement to add onto your license, and that requires 180 days of sea time on sailing vessels if you're applying for the inland, and then 360 for near coastal. And you can always keep your sail endorsement. So I started with my 150-ton sail endorsement, and every time I applied for an upgrade, I said, and sail endorsement. So now I have a 1,600-ton sail endorsement. I don't think there's a vessel out there that I could sail with that, but they add one and one together and give it to you, which is pretty exciting. So I always tell folks, if you have sea time on sailing vessels, get that endorsement. It's a 20-question exam. Some of the questions can be a little tricky because they may have been written by someone who looked in a sailing textbook and wasn't a sailor, but I just put up an example question. There'd be 20 questions that are, this one's probably medium hard question, I would say. So the answer to this one, does anyone want to throw up the answer? A. Great, yes, a preventer, thanks. So preventer is gonna hold your boom out in theory to prevent you from jibing. And so, yeah, I would say this one, I picked this one because I figured the group could answer it. I would say there's a few where you're like, really? We don't ever use that vocab word. And so what I would say is if you're getting a sail endorsement, either pick up a study guide and read through a bunch of the questions, or you could take a prep class, and it's usually the Coast Guard requires 4 hours for a auxiliary sail prep class. So either one, depending how you study. Oh, another great question, just going back here. So as you think about your sea time, it's cumulative. So when I went for my 1,600-ton, that's I think 1,200 something days of sea time. That was me adding up every single day. So it means I got to use the time I submitted for my 100-ton. Those 360 days, they don't go away. They just keep adding. The only time you can't double dip is if you are also applying to be an engineer, a qualified engineer. You can't take time you submitted for a deck officer license and become an engineer with it. But if you're going from 6-pack to 25 to 100-ton and higher, all that time is cumulative. The Coast Guard keeps it in your file for, depending how large how full their filing space in West Virginia gets, about 1 to 5 years, and then they send it to the National Archives. What's really cool about that is you can request to have your file pulled from the National Archives to look at it. So if you submitted sea time 20 years ago, they can pull your file and look at it so that you can upgrade. So it is cumulative. Donna asked, can you have a 6-pack license with a sail endorsement? That's a great question. I'm going to say I think so, but Deb is our pro of six packs. So if you want to tell me I'm wrong, that would be awesome. But I think you can. I think you can because you, yes. Okay, great. And the reason why that to me seemed to make perfect sense is you can't be the captain of a sailboat or have a license to drive a sailboat without that sail endorsement. So that makes perfect sense. So if someone calls you up and you have your captain's license, says, hey, can you come drive this catamaran tonight? You know, I've got 50 people coming out and I just need someone to come take the boat out. If you don't have that sail endorsement and that boat has an auxiliary power of sail, then you are not qualified to take that catamaran out. So just something to think about for folks in here as a power boater, and also looking to work on your license is if you can get yourself out on a sailboat. If you'd like to work on them, then you'll need to. Okay. And then our other endorsement, that's an optional endorsement at this tonnage level, is going to be the assistance towing endorsement. And so this is not, you can't go be a tugboat captain with this. What this would qualify you to do, well, you know, I guess it wouldn't hurt. This isn't, I guess, saying you have on the ground experience with towing or tugs, but what it's doing is it's qualifying you to work on an assist vessel, a vessel that may hook up to another boat to tow them in. And so the places I see people using this most frequently are going to be working for Sea Tow, Towboat US, or something else like that. And so it's a great option to have. Most captain's license prep courses will offer it either as part of the class or as an add-on. There's no reason not to do it, especially if you're looking for a career. So if you would like to request this, what you do on your application is you would say, you know, say, Miranda, you're looking for the inland mates license. You can say inland mates and assistance towing endorsement. And then the Coast Guard will, if you haven't taken the class, then they're going to request that you come in and take that 20-person test. But you don't need any background or experience. And again, that's why I'd say this isn't going to get you a job on a tugboat in Long Beach. But it would get you a job for Sea Tow. And so the questions, though, I would caution you, even though I say that it's, you know, it's for limited tonnages, the questions often come from the world of towing, like commercial towing. So the vocabulary, this kind of the size and scope of the questions can be outside the scope of a small boat mariner. So I would say if you're going to do this endorsement, to either take a prep class or to get yourself a study guide, because you'll find that once you read through them, you'll get the terminology, but it's probably not something you're using on your smaller boat. And so again, here is an example. Anyone want to throw up their educated guess for the answer here? And you might think about if you've, you know, been pulling, say, a small sailboat from the mooring into the dock using a Boston whaler. Sometimes I like to think about towing and side tows and towing from behind, and just how I would maneuver a small boat with another small boat behind me. D, excellent. So yeah, to obtain better steering control. So you want to have your rudders and your propulsion behind the thing that you're towing. That way you can really maneuver it. So that's the type of question you might see, but then you're also going to see some vocabulary questions too. The Coast Guard can only test you on so much sitting in a chair with a piece of paper, and so it can get pretty arcane. So talking about the exams, I'm going to talk about the exams from a couple different angles. So way back in the day, people would just go into their regional exam center. They'd go to the Coast Guard. So regional exam centers are federal facilities run by the Coast Guard that you go into. It's a testing room. Each testing room has a number of books because many of the tests are open book. They have all the charts you need to plot. They don't have plotting tools. They don't have pencils for you unless they're really nice. I feel like when I went to test in Ohio, they had pencils, but not in Boston. So you go in and you take your exams there, and even the person offering the exam might not know the answers. So going into test at a regional exam center, you really need to know your stuff. And the way that you do that is you apply for your license without having taken a prep class. So they're not going to see any certificate of completion. They'll send you a letter, what they call a letter to test. So if I apply for a 100-ton, I don't send them a course completion certificate. They send me a letter to test. It's going to list each of the modules. So we'll talk about the modules in a couple minutes. And then you go in and take those exams. It's doable, but I would say it's doable, A, for people who have pulled out a paper chart before and you've used plotting tools before, and you have time on your hands to study and not just read through a study guide. And I've put up a few tools here, but really if you have not pulled out a paper chart and plotted, or you're not really adaptable to learning from YouTube videos on how to plot, it's going to be very hard to go in. The plotting exam for the 100-ton is 10 questions. You need to get 9 of them right. They're multiple choice. That's very deceiving though, because it's not like, you know, pick one of 4. You're going to plot your position, find the latitude and longitude, and then your lat long is going to be one of those 4 answers. But the second answer may be 1, 2, or 3 decimal points off from the one that you found. And so you really have to have the right answer, or you have a 25% shot of getting that question right. So not trying to scare anyone into taking a prep class, just letting you know that walking in cold turkey is probably not very doable. Now, the other thing that's very interesting, and I've just been blown away by the fact, is that, you know, when all these tests were designed, they were designed for the way people were working on the water. So using paper charts, using their radio, not using AIS. There's no questions about AIS in the Coast Guard data bank because it wasn't invented when they wrote the questions. So the problem is there's people who are really competent on the water who really can use their electronic tools, and they walk in and all of this is paper navigation. And so as time passes, no one else is answering. Thanks for answering, Deb. Sorry, I was looking at the chat box there. So as time passes, competent mariners may find it even harder to pass these tests if you're practicing all of your navigation electronically. I have to say that as much as it would be great for the Coast Guard to shift and test us on what we're using on the water, it's not going to happen fast. They're still trying to rewrite questions that are already outdated. Because their questions are they're outdated. They have a small workforce trying to keep the merchant marines going. So we can all complain about how none of the questions test us on electronic navigation and who needs a paper chart. But if you want a captain's license, you need to learn how to plot on a paper chart. I'm going to stop lecturing now. But a few books that I love, the Get Your Captain's License, I put this book under my pillow and I studied it front to back, and that's how I got through my first exams. It's the guy who writes it doesn't add fluff, but if there's a word in there that you think is new, then it's probably going to be on the exams. It's really teaching to the test, but you also have to be willing to work yourself through kind of a textbook study guide, which can be dry, and he only gives so much as an explanation how to do things. So it's great for folks who kind of already have a step into the world of the material. Then there is an app on, I think right now it's only an Apple Store app and not an Android. So you need an iPad or an iPhone to use it. It's called Upgrade You. It's about $30, but it has all the Coast Guard questions in it. And it has a lot of reference material so that you can work your way through the questions. What I like about using apps, even if you end up taking a prep course, what's nice about the apps that are on the market these days is they categorize your questions. So if you keep getting a question right, it throws it out, and then it will test you on the harder questions. So for those of you who, who work well on your phone, who have a few moments here and there throughout the day to study, there are some great apps and they complement what you're doing very well. If you're just using an app to study, then I consider that cramming, you're memorizing. And certainly, like for instance, when I took my celestial test, there's one question I could not figure out how to answer. So I memorized every single question in the Coast Guard question bank, which was about 20. So it's doable, right? That was celestial, which is kind of arcane. With some of this other stuff, the Coast Guard database might have 1,000 questions for one topic. So you're not going to be able to cram in the same way. So in that regard, again, learning the material is the right thing to do. And then finally, the last book here is the Rules of the Road. You will be tested on the rules of the road and need a 90% to pass, and it's a closed book exam. The questions the Coast Guard write for rules of the road are very much written using the language of this book. So say you get some nice flashcards from your local bookstore, or even some of the more simplified apps. It's going to ask a question, like might say, you know, what color is the stern light? Well, the Coast Guard could ask the same question, but just phrase it in such a way that you have a lot more trouble answering it. And so I always tell people, read the rules of the road front to back, as dry as it may seem, because then you've heard the way the Coast Guard says it. And the other thing they do is they put the inland rule right next to the international rule, so you can see the differences between the two. So it's like a $9 book, and you can highlight all over it. One thing you do want to watch out for when you grab that book is that you have the most up-to-date one, because they do publish updates to the rules of the road. And I've seen people fail because they had an outdated version and studied really well. Does anyone have questions about these study materials? Or any others that you've heard of? Chrissy.
I have a question on the, I have Charlie Wing's book. Does he pretty much cover everything, or are there going to be questions that are on the test that aren't covered in the book?
I think what he's done in the back, he has question banks. And I think what he's done is he's looked through the question banks and pulled each topic question that asks say a block those block and tackle questions, but he's going to have a version of each.
About halfway through, everything you said was all garbled.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I was probably waving my hands too much. Charlie Wing is going to have an example of each type of question. He will have a question in the Coast Guard database, but I believe he covers each type of question. 2014 is the correct date, 2014 or newer for rules. To answer the other question. Christy, did I get your question? Ish, okay. All right, and then the other option is to take a prep class. And so we offer a prep class. There are prep classes offered in a lot of maritime locations around the country. The way prep classes work is that the school that's offering it has applied to the Coast Guard to be approved to teach the class and then offer a certificate at the end. I'm not aware of any schools that are not approved that are offering this material, but you certainly want to make sure. Oh, thanks, Deb. Yeah, you can get the rules of the road in PDF form for free. If you do that, I suggest using an e-reader so that you can set it up with the pages side by side, so you can compare inland and international. I've done that on my iPad and using the Kindle reader so that you can have those two side by side, and it's much easier than scrolling down. All right, so back to prep schools. The Coast Guard approves schools to teach these classes. I think it would be rare that there would be a school out there that would sell a course and not be approved, but you certainly want to make sure it's a Coast Guard approved class. When the Coast Guard approves the class, it's going to have a number of hours that are required for the students to be in the classroom. So you're essentially, the Coast Guard's approving you to sit and learn all this material and take the exam from the school instead of going to a regional exam center. But the trade-off is that you need to attend all those classes. Our classes are just under 80 hours, so it's a lot of material. And you'll see these classes offered in a couple different formats. You might see them condensed into 2 or 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, or you might see them nights and weekends. I would say the class that works really well for folks that we have here is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Saturday, and that's for 5 weeks. Is it the same test, Colleen? Awesome question. So most schools have taken their questions from the Coast Guard data bank, because then they know the Coast Guard will approve their tests. The Coast Guard data bank was made available to people for a long time, so you could pull questions and build your own test. So for instance, OCC, we've built our test, we've given it to a bunch of students, we've thrown out questions that people always get wrong, get confusing, are written poorly. And so for one thing, the advantage to a prep class is that your test has been vetted by the instructor, by previous students, and questions that just don't work well for learning. We all know there's bad questions, for the most part, have been vetted out. Whereas the Coast Guard, they pull from their data bank and their computer generates a 50-question test. It's printed out and given to you. And so you might get questions that range all over the book. Whereas in a prep class, it is our goal that we are able to have successful mariners. So, you know, in our class, we really work to teach all the subject material, but we also know what's on the test so that we can prepare you for it. So in that sense, I would say the advantage to taking the prep class is that you're going to be learning material that's more directly geared towards the exam than if you pick up resources like I had on my last slide and just try to cram. The test, an interesting thing about the data bank of questions is that the Coast Guard had made it publicly available for a long time, and then they took it away from public access. But there's a lot of people out there who've put questions up on the web, so you can access most of them anyway. But it is kind of interesting is that you have to, you know, play around on the internet to find these questions. People like the app Upgrade You that I talked to you about, they own that data bank still, and so they put it into their app, and that's why these apps have become popular. Chrissy?
So does that mean I can't copy Debbie Dunn's answers when she takes the test?
Well, we have 3 versions, and usually we alternate. So if you copy her questions, yeah, you would probably not do too well. But that's funny, but it does remind me, yeah, so we actually have 3 versions. And same with our class as the Coast Guard's class, you have 3 tries. And so we have 3 versions. You can take each of those 3 versions, then you'd have to retake the whole class. The Coast Guard, you can go in 3 times as well. If you test following a prep class at the school, then you do not need to go test with the Coast Guard. So you can actually get your license without ever going into a regional exam center now, if you wish. Now, of course, one thing we haven't spoken about is self-studying is free and a prep course is not. And so that's usually where people will sit around and study for a while on their own. And some people it works very well for. But I would say these days we're finding a lot of people coming in to take classes with us because there's a lot of material that they don't touch in their day-to-day.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please.
One thing on the prep class, and I think somebody had a question on this, is that usually the test follows directly after the prep class. So you have already gotten a whole load of possible questions through the class, and then right when the class is done, you take your test, which is good for the memory. The problem sometimes with testing with the regional exam center is that you get your notice to test and you practice on your own, and then you have to you know, apply for that date to test on. Well, that could be, you know, 2 weeks down the road, and you've just crammed for a month, and then have to do additional cramming. You know, you want to make sure that that knowledge is fresh. So that's sometimes an issue too.
Thanks, Deb. That's really helpful. And yeah, we heard you well. And one instance I can think of actually where that I had a colleague that really set back was she was studying for her engineering license, and then the government was furloughed and test dates were pushed back till the government opened up. So that was last year, and that was a while. And she actually ended up going to sea, and it took about 6 months for her to go into test. And so certainly we don't want to hedge our bets against whether or not their offices are open, but these days it's another thing to consider. And to that regard, at the end of the webinar, I'll touch on a few differences that the National Maritime Center has issued because of COVID-19, but we'll save that for the end.
So Sarah, if I understood correctly, then what you're saying is if you take the prep course at OCC, immediately afterwards you take the Coast Guard exam?
Yeah, exactly. So the way we'll typically schedule it is, you know, if the class is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and we'll give everyone a day or two to study and come in Monday morning. And so, yeah, you'll have been doing your practice tests right up until then. So fresh in your mind.
Just also so that everybody knows, if you do a prep course, if it's a, well, hopefully Coast Guard licensed prep course, all the tests that they give you, pre-tests, if you will, quizzes beforehand, all of those quiz questions and all of the questions that are on all the exams cannot be repeats. So you're going to find a lot of similar questions, differently worded, but you're not going to find repeated. So if you take a quiz on, I don't know, rules of the road, and then go take your rules of the road test, you're not going to find the exact same questions from the quizzes to the exams normally, but that gives you a bigger knowledge base to see more wording and things like that.
Thanks. So at the end, I'm going to open up the OCC webpage for a second and show you how you can sign up for first aid and CPR. The other class I recommend to folks, though, is we have a class called Coastal Navigation. We have 1 and 2. Coastal Nav 1 is a great setup for people who haven't had the chance to do a lot of paper plotting, who haven't done, say, tides and currents. And the instructor for that class that we have on at the moment actually is a unlimited master mariner, went to Cal Maritime. So she knows what questions you might see on the Coast Guard exam, but she's also teaching you how to navigate as a mariner. It's a really neat class because you get that blend of doing it for practical applications, but also then, you know, could apply that towards then stepping into a license prep course. So I think the last thing before I move on from this slide is most license prep classes you get into, you're going to find are fast-paced and are set up to be taught to people who already have a knowledge base. They're not intending to take, you know, landlubbers and turn them into captains. They're intending to take unlicensed mariners and turn them into licensed mariners. And so for that reason, if you look through the, you know, in a couple minutes, I'm going to put the topics up. If you look through those topics and most of them you have no idea what you're looking at, I would say pick up a copy of Charlie Wing first or take coastal navigation first before stepping into a prep class. So again, the prep class is not taking landlubber and turning them into a captain. It's taking a mariner and turning them into a captain. So the exams, so navigation general, these are the topics you'll see at the 100-ton level or the 25, 50-ton level. Navigation general, deck safety, rules of the road, and plotting. Now, these general and safety topics, that's a huge, broad amount of topics. In a moment, I'll click to my next slide and show you some of those topics. And so we actually have a bunch of publications that you can use. You can use publications for every exam except for the rules of the road, which means it's open book. The thing is, you need to know how the books work. And there are many people who will go in and take their Coast Guard exams and never open a book because they don't know how they work. But especially for instance, our deck general, deck safety, there might be a question about how many fire extinguishers should be in the galley of a cargo vessel. Well, shoot, I'm not going to memorize that. There's no reason I need to know that. I can look it up in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is on the bookshelf. Both in the test prep classroom, these books are available, as well as if you go into test with the Coast Guard. But again, if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't have time in the 2 hours that you have to take your test to learn how those books work. As you can see, it's a 70% pass rate on the first 3 exams. And again, you have 3 tries. So, you know, that feels pretty good, pretty comfortable. Rules of the road, 90%, you're not going to earn that unless you know your material. And then same thing with plotting, is going to be 10 questions, of which usually at least 8 of those involve doing work on your chart with your plotting tools and your pencil. The other 2 questions may be looking things up in the Tide Tidal Currents book, or in Chart 1, which is essentially a guide to chart symbols. But everything else is actually plotting with your pencil on the chart. So I'm going to go over to break out these topics a little more. And I'm actually, well, I'm starting to run over the hour, but we're doing great. Everyone seems like you're alive on the other end, hopefully. Chrissy says you read that you don't take that you take rules of the road first. Yeah, so it is typical at the Coast Guard. You go into the REC, they'll give you rules of the road first because they don't want to bother to give you any other test if you can't pass that, because for most people it is the hardest. At a test prep school, I'm not sure that they're required to give you rules or not, but I do think it's typical. And I'm pretty sure that's what we do, is give people rules. But I know we had a student recently who said, hey, I want to take a test I feel good about first. And we were able to let her do that because we weren't required. Great question. So if you look down this list of exam topics, for instance, one that I would throw out there, vessel construction. This doesn't have terms like, we're not talking about hammers and nails. We're talking about like interior bulkheads and other things that are very archaic words to describe a cargo vessel that you're going to need to have memorized essentially. There's a lot of diagrams that you may need to identify parts of, again, like cargo vessel, hull portions, things like that. A lot of questions about fire procedures, as you can see in my second column here. I'm going to go through this pretty fast, but again, these are topics that you would see pop up, of course, in a prep class or in Charlie Wing if you were to get that book, for instance. And then over here on the far right are all of our navigation topics. So you're going to be doing your chart navigation, but your chart navigation question might also have you correct compass error before even plotting. So if they tell you to plot, a 3-bearing fix, but you need to correct it from compass to true, then in a way they're almost asking you 2 questions in one. So I really, when you see that 10-question test, I always like to let people know it feels like more than 10 questions. I've just pulled just 5 different questions from the bank to put up here. What I want to do is have a 10-minute break for everyone, but we're just going to have these up here and we can look over them when we come back. So it's 8:11. So what I want to do is come back at 8:21. That'll let everyone get up, move around. And then what we're going to do from this point to the end of the webinar is actually look at all the paperwork components for filing for your application. So if you've gotten to this point in the webinar, your kid's crying, you're hungry, you want some ice cream, and you don't want to apply for your license, you can head out. I hope that's not the case for anyone, but it is kind of a natural break. So I'll see everyone back in 10 minutes, okay? Thanks.